Jazz was for ordinary people. Jazz is ordinary people.
Good evening. A couple. Doesn't count. I know all you. I know like half the people in here today. My name is Cleve Corner. I'm the manager of author and speaker engagement at the Pratt Library. Thanks for coming out this evening. I very much appreciate it. Before we start, just a little bit of housekeeping. First, John's going to speak for about 30 minutes. He's got his PowerPoint right here. And then your questions, there'll be a microphone right here and there'll be a microphone right there. Please direct your questions to the mics. We have folks watching at home on our YouTube and Facebook pages. Folks that don't know, most of our programs are hybrid. So if you can't make it or if you missed a program, we also archive them there as well. Snug Books is our book selling partner here this evening. So after the program, please purchase a book and John will be happy to talk afterwards and sign your book. Today, I'm happy to welcome John Grinspan to the Pratt Library to discuss his book, Wide Awake, The Forgotten Force That Elected Lincoln and Spurred the Civil War. In it, he recounts that at the start of the 1860 presidential campaign, a handful of fired-up young Northerners appeared as bodyguards to defend anti-slavery stump speakers from frequent attacks. The group called themselves the Wide Awakes. Soon, hundreds of thousands of young white and black men and a number of women were organizing boisterous, uniformed, torch-bearing brigades of their own. These Wide Awakes, mostly working-class Americans in their 20s, became one of the largest, most spectacular, and most influential political movements in our history. To some, it demonstrated the power of a rising majority to push back against slavery. To others, it looked like a paramilitary force trying to invade the South. Within a year, the nation would be at war with itself, and many on both sides would point to the Wide Awakes as the mechanism that got them there. John Grinspan is curator of political history at the Smithsonian's National Museum of American History. He's the author of the award-winning The Virgin Vote, How Young Americans Made Democracy Social, Politics Personal, and Voting Popular in the 19th Century. He frequently contributes to the New York Times and has been featured in the New Yorker, the Washington Post, and elsewhere. In Booklist starred review of the book, they wrote, Grinspan accomplishes the exciting feat of illuminating an underexplored facet of 19th century American history in this well-written, well-organized, and thoroughly researched account of the Wide Awake movement. He insightfully shows how their use of symbols, ideology, and activism has influenced American politics to the present day. Bestselling author Alexis Coe relayed John Grinspan's richly detailed book more than earns its place on the teeming shelf of Civil War histories. This timely story of the half-forgotten Wide Awakes bears a powerful message for our frustrating political moment. The force that binds a coalition together lives as much in the feeling body as it does in the thinking head. And fellow author Ted Widmer commented, "At last, we have a history worthy of the Wide Awakes." It's my great pleasure to welcome John Grinspan to the Pratt Library.
Thank you, Cleve. Thank you, everybody, for coming tonight. I see it's a nice, intimate crowd, so I'm expecting a question from each of you, and I will call on you afterwards, so get ready. As Cleve mentioned, I'm going to talk to you tonight about the Wide Awakes, but I am also curator of political history at the Smithsonian, and we collect from contemporary as well as historical politics. So if you are not interested at all in the story of the Wide Awakes, but you have some question about the Smithsonian, I'd love to try to address that too. Go. How do you get people to stand up for a good cause? How do you bring together a diverse coalition that can actually win? How do you find the line between political speech and political violence? When and how does an election become a civil war? These are all questions we're debating today as we prepare for a contentious election this November, as we advocate for social change, and as we watch our politics devolve into tribal division. They seem like questions without precedent, but really they were all addressed by a surprising, inspiring, and troubling political movement from deep in the history of American democracy. Among the largest and most controversial, most consequential, and also one of the weirdest mass movements and one that's especially important in the history of Baltimore specifically, the Wide Awakes of 1860. They're also among the least well-known, oddly. Have any of you ever heard of the Wide Awake? Show of hands. We've got 1, 2. Nice, good guys. You win some points right there. All right. It's striking and telling that this movement hasn't been heard of by most people because their story is so important. It helps explain how Lincoln won the election of 1860, how the Civil War came, how slavery ended, and how Americans can mobilize in a democracy. And most important to me, it's a great way to ask the question, where's the line between mobilizing, motivating people, and menacing and intimidating them? Where is that line between standing up for a good cause and breaking the norms of a democracy? Really, in a democracy, how far is too far? Just a quick background on the Wide Awakes so I don't get too far ahead of myself. The Wide Awakes are a mass movement in the election before the Civil War, the election of 1860. They wore, past tense, they wore militaristic uniforms, caps, capes. They marched at midnight rallies lit by torches against slavery and slavery's threat to American democracy. They were really a huge mass movement. We're talking hundreds of thousands, perhaps 500,000 people across America at a time when the nation's population was 31 million. So this is maybe 1 in every 60 American was affiliated with this club. And they're an incredibly diverse club. They're really a grassroots movement led by young people, mostly working class young people in the North, but also including fugitive slaves and African Americans, recent immigrants, but also people who were at odds with them, know-nothings, nativists. Some people are conservative, some people are radical. There are a few women in the club who start their own companies. And they're really one striking story of kind of diverse grassroots mobilization right on the eve of the Civil War. Their impact is kind of way outside of our memory of them. At the time, in 1860, people from Abe Lincoln to Frederick Douglass, from the first secessionists to Ulysses S. Grant, from European reporters to children in America's streets, agreed that the Wide Awakes were something brand new that historians would be talking about for generations afterwards. The New York Tribune wrote, after that election in 1860, on the eve of the Civil War, the Wide Awakes were the most imposing, most influential, and most potent political organization that ever existed in this country. Now, to me, perhaps most importantly, the Wide Awakes help us explain how the fight over American democracy got us to civil war in this nation, how the Civil War is caused by a political struggle. We have this image, I think, most of us were taught in school, of how the Civil War came. We know there's an election, we know people are arguing over slavery, and then it kind of cuts to people in blue and gray uniforms on a field in Virginia or Maryland or Tennessee. And that really misses the fundamental way that the Civil War evolved from an election into a military conflict that grew contiguously from the political club, the Wide Awakes, how they went from a club to a movement to the Union Army, essentially. And in doing so, that helps us understand kind of the promise and some of the danger in American democracy. And I think helps us make more sense of the world we live in today. And also, because we're in Baltimore, so much of this story unfolded in these streets outside within half a mile of this area. It's a really important Baltimore story, almost more than anywhere else. Now, to start, the Civil War was caused by slavery. This is an indisputable fact. If you want to argue it, you can, but we're not going to. But the question is, how did the Civil War cause slavery in 1861? How did this institution begun in 1619 that had existed for generations and generations and generations cause this war hundreds of years later? And the answer is that it came through politics. It came through a political fight over slavery between radical proponents of slavery who are pushing to expand slavery and this strange kind of diverse coalition of people who are pushing back against slavery, some of whom oppose it for strong moral reasons, some of whom oppose it for political, even selfish reasons. How did these two sides kind of square off in 1860? It starts with this incredible growth of slavery in the mid-19th century, that people will tell you that slavery was going to die on its own, but this is nonsense. Slavery is bigger and stronger before the Civil War in the 1850s than it ever was before. It's expanding from the South into the West. The values, the amount of money associated with enslaved people is never higher. There are people fighting to reopen the slave trade with Africa, which had been closed. And fugitive slaves who've gone to the North are being chased through the Fugitive Slave Act and brought back into slavery in the 1850s. The wealthiest states in America on the eve of the Civil War are all in the South, and the poorest states in America are all in the North. This is a growing dominant power. And it's also captured the main party in the nation at the time, the Democratic Party, which started as kind of a diverse and interesting movement. By the 1850s, by the years before the Civil War, it's a tool of the slave power, which is the term people use. Slave power means this big conspiracy, not just of enslavers, of the small minority of people who claim to own people, but of people who support them in the North and the South, who are kind of aligned in expanding slavery. And it's really building up resentment among a lot of people. It's threatening three kind of fundamental elements. First of all, there's just the obvious moral threat of slavery, right? It's clearly an evil. The people trapped in it, the men, women, and children, the 4 million of them are trapped in bondage as their ancestors were, and it's an inexcusable threat. The problem is the number of people in a country with a significant white majority that see that moral threat is not enough to end slavery, right? Like some people kind of shrug their head and say, yeah, that's bad, but I'm not going to do anything about it. There are other threats that mobilize people more. The second is the threat to majority rule. 2% of the nation claimed to own slaves in 1860, right? Most people don't. I'm going to say own slaves. I don't see the believe in that, but that's how they saw themselves. Most people do not own slaves in America in 1860. The great majority don't. 14% of the nation are enslaved, men, women, and children in slavery. That leaves 86% of the nation who has to pick a side between these two forces. And as the North grows and grows and grows into a much larger majority, a tiny minority has captured politics. Like I said, they're pushing slavery further west. They've taken over the Supreme Court. 5 of the 9 Supreme Court justices were enslavers, owned enslaved people. 5 of the 9, 2% of the population. It's totally disproportionate. The 3/5 clause in the Constitution is swinging elections and control of Congress to this smaller and smaller minority of people. And just in terms of majority versus minority, it's pissing the majority off. These people who do not own slaves see themselves as being trampled upon, no matter how they feel morally about it. It's also an incredible threat to free speech. There are laws in all southern states and many northern states banning the criticism of slavery. You can't criticize it, not just in South Carolina or in Georgia, but in Illinois, in Pennsylvania, in Kansas. It is becoming illegal to print an anti-slavery paper, to stand on the street and criticize it. And this is a growing force in the 1860s. And it goes along with this culture of violence. In the South, obviously, slavery is maintained by violence, by incredible violence on slave plantations. Out in Kansas, where they're territories, there's basically a war being fought between pro-slavery and pro-freedom forces during those years. And elections are being stolen. And on the floor of Congress, senators are being beaten for criticizing slavery publicly, like Charles Sumner. The future vice president of the Confederacy, Alexander Stephens, said, "I have no objection to liberty of speech when liberty of the cudgel is left free to combat it," which is basically saying you can criticize slavery, but we're coming for you, right? And this builds on this culture, this era called mobbing. There we go. There's this culture across the nation of mob attacks on different populations all over this whole era. Thousands of mob attacks on, new immigrants, Catholics, Mormons, brothel owners. It happens a lot, but the main targets are abolitionists, anti-slavery speakers, and African-American communities. These are just 2 examples that happen in Philadelphia, but the center of mobbing in America is Baltimore. Baltimore was known as Mobtown at the time. That's its name. People use it all the time. They don't even say Baltimore. They say Mobtown and expect you to know that we're talking about the city here. So Baltimore is a really diverse, really tumultuous city at the time, and there's regular violence in the streets between political parties, between ethnic groups, between racial groups. And the worst version of it is targeting abolitionists and African-American communities. There's just regular violence, and this is driving the sense of breakdown of democracy. The democracy is being seized by slaveholders in Congress and kind of in the halls of power, and on the streets, you're seeing more violence, more aggression, this kind of things. So there are all these populations who are mad at the slave power for one reason or another. They're abolitionists, African Americans, white evangelicals, recent immigrants from Germany who are opposed to slavery on moral grounds. But they're not really winning elections. There just aren't enough of them in the right places to swing elections. Then there's a really big population of people like Abe Lincoln who are opposed to slavery in theory and opposed to it expanding anymore. As Lincoln says, we don't take a snake and put it in with the children. We don't add slavery to the new territories, but they're not going to get rid of it in Georgia tomorrow. And then there's another population of people who are mad at the Democratic Party that is organizing these riots, pushing slavery. So there's kind of partisanship, there's identity, there's morality, and all these people basically hate each other and can't get along. But as the slave power pushes more and more and demands more and more, it's violence in the streets, kind of taking over Western territories, there's a sense that everybody who hates slavery is being pushed together into an alliance. They might not actually like each other, but they are participating in what Henry Adams called the systematic organization of hatreds, which he says runs politics. That politics is about aligning people who also hate the same force. And in the 1850s, the slave power is really making themselves hated this way. It really is a powder keg going into 1860, and all it really needs is a spark. Now the spark happens in a really unexpected place with a really unexpected person. That young man there is named Edgar Jurgensen. He's a 19-year-old kid in Hartford, Connecticut. Hartford is a peaceful, wealthy, orderly New England town. It's not where you expect Civil War to start, but Hartford has mobbing. Hartford has fighting between anti-slavery and pro-slavery people. And Eddie Jurgensen isn't who you'd expect to start a movement either. He's 19 years old. He works in a textile store. He lives in the same store. He makes $50 a year. He has no social connections. He's just basically a kid working behind the counter. But one night in the February of 1860, one cold night in Connecticut, they have an anti-slavery rally, and they're going to be marching with torches. And Eddie doesn't want to get his new jacket covered in torch oil. You know, when you march with a torch, it can leak the oil. So he gets a length of waterproof fabric and makes a cape, throws it over his shoulders. He works in a textile store and sews a little makeshift cape. That's how this movement gets started. He gets 5 other kids who work in the store to make the same capes, and they get torches and they stand out. And when this anti-slavery event ends and people come out from the lecture hall, they see these 5 guys in shining black capes standing in the night with torches, and it clicks. It sends the same message as the kind of anti-slavery argument that's being made at lecture halls, right? It looks dynamic, it looks aggressive, it looks like people who are willing to stand up. And so they put these guys, they put Eddie and his friends in the front of this procession, and they march through town that night. And as they're marching through town, they get attacked by some Democratic thugs. They're Republicans. And Eddie and his friends help beat back this attack. And then the movement's on. They meet the next week in a kind of dingy 3rd floor apartment, 36 guys, friends of Eddie's, to form an organization. They pick uniforms, capes and caps. They elect a leader who's one of the guys who fought the most in the street fight the week before, and they need a name. And one of them says, how about the Wide Awakes? And they've picked their name right there. It gives a sense of being awake, alert, especially for young people finally waking up to what's going on in the country. And it mobilizes this movement and takes off right from there. They start drilling in the street at night with torches. They get instructions on how military companies should march, and they start practicing with this kind of faux militarism, right? They're standing up against slavery. They're standing up for majority rule and free speech, and they're orderly. They march in silence. They really send this compelling visual of, imagine a 19th century street, people, stomping through it in uniforms with torches in the middle of the night in absolute silence. In a world, in a democracy that looks like chaos, it seems like they have some order. And while everything else seems like it's falling apart, the Wide Awakes give this compelling sense that they have a sense of organization. They have the random good luck, their first march through town, they escort Abe Lincoln, who happens to be traveling through the area. And their role, they walk with him and they walk with anti-slavery speakers, and they also work as a bodyguard. So when speakers get attacked, when thugs try to break up their rallies, the Wide Awakes go fight them. And when they win a fight, that's cool and they look good. But when they lose a fight, that's when they really take off. They take their members, their club members who've been injured, who are still bleeding, and put them in uniform on stage behind anti-slavery speakers. And this sends this message that we have this grievance, we're this force, look at the oppression we're facing just to march through the streets. That is incredibly motivating. It's almost like a black flag the Wide Awakes are waving, and it takes off across the North. People see it particularly in Chicago, where the convention is going to be, the Republican convention that year. And they organize their own Wide Awake companies. Now, nobody from Connecticut went to Chicago, but through the newspaper network, They explain, here's how you form a club, here's how you get the capes, here's how you march, here's how you elect leaders, here's your secret codes if you're going to fight. Like if there's going to be an attack, they always yell, do your duty, as the thing they yell before they charge. So they're setting this off. It's not a secret club, it's in the newspapers, but it's still giving the sense that like you are being brought into this movement. And it explodes from there. By the end of that summer, the wide awakes have spread to every northern state, California, starting to trickle into the South. Every major city, many villages, hundreds of thousands of people are signing up for these rallies from really across the nation. An incredibly diverse mass movement. You have kind of white working class kids as the bedrock, but you start getting immigrants joining up, people especially who came from Germany, from the revolutions in 1848, who are kind of radicals, they start joining up. And yet the same movement is recruiting people who were know-nothings a couple years before, who were anti-immigrants a couple years before. They managed to get people who hate each other, who are at odds with each other, into the same movement. It's that systematic organization of hatreds. And because they wear the capes, because they march, it feels like they're all together, right? It gives some sense. They get radicals and moderates into it, and they start, by the end of the summer, to trickle into the Upper South. We don't really think of Maryland as the South today, but in 1860, it absolutely was. Places like Maryland, Missouri, Virginia, we're on the fence today, right? But back then, these states maintained slavery, and the people there saw themselves as Southerners. And so when Baltimore gets a mass movement of wide awakes going, when Washington, D.C. has wide awakes marching in the street, when Wheeling, Virginia, and St. Louis, and all these towns that are within the slaveholding South organize these movements, it really sends a message, right? This movement is spreading even into the part of the region that maintains slavery, because so many people are opposed to the slave power. It's not easy to be a wide awake in Baltimore. Every time they march, there's violence. There's an account from the Wheeling, then Virginia wide awakes who say, it's really hard to be a wide awake in Virginia, but at least we're not Baltimore, right? Baltimore, mob town, and right around this area, Pratt Street, Utah, by the Camden Station, this is where there's street fighting every time the wide awakes try to march. But they're spreading, and they're inspiring people who are opposed to slavery, and they're really scaring people who are opposed to the wide awakes. They scare people even more and also inspire people when African-American clubs form. First in Oberlin, and then in Boston and in Portland, fugitive slaves and African-Americans in the North start to form their own clubs. They get uniforms, they elect leaders, and march in these rallies. And this is really transgressive. They're using militarism, they're using partisanship in public. This is not just a big move for 19th century America, but it's an incredibly brave step, because what they're doing is marching in these midnight mass rallies surrounded by a large number of white people with torches. Obviously, anyone who's grown up in these communities knows how often violence breaks out, the threat they're putting themselves into, but they want to participate in this election. And so you get leaders like Lewis Hayton, who escaped slavery in Kentucky, organizing the West Boston colored wide awakes, as they called themselves at the time. And they start working with local communities to turn out the vote, to be able to speak, and to be able to fight if need be. People in the South and Democrats are terrified of all this. The idea of this mass movement that's growing, marching in uniforms with military orders, with companies, including African Americans, trickling into the South, it's really ominous for many people. So people start to organize what they call offsets to the wide awakes, which are basically paramilitary pushbacks. They're saying in northern cities, and especially in the South, if the wide awakes come down here, we're going to be ready for them. Democratic clubs, it's a four-way election at this point. So there are all these different clubs forming all over America, in Baltimore and DC and New Orleans and Charleston. And if you look at their rallies, if you look at their images, I think you can see immediately the difference. Take a look at those, and then take a look at the blue image. The wide awakes, they project order, right? They stand at attention, they march, they do all these drills, they have leadership. The Democratic Party, it looks like this chaos, looks like this mobbing. They're just wilder, they're drunker. The wide awakes were usually sober during their rallies. The Democrats definitely weren't. They're kind of projecting further the sense that American democracy is spiraling. And in a way, they help the wide awakes, because the wide awakes still look like order. They look like the grown-ups in the room, and they look like the only people who can promise anything. The organization that takes off in Baltimore and in DC is a club called the National Volunteers. They're this kind of shadowy organization of Southern Democrats who basically want to fight the wide awakes and form their own clubs in case the wide awakes come south. In Baltimore, there are a couple thousand of them, and they're connected to kind of the most elite families in town. And in DC, a lot of them are actually Capitol policemen who guard the US Capitol and are also in these clubs. We know they're starting to form, but we don't know too much about them as of Election Day. The election in November is a really weird election. Lincoln wins, you know that, but his election is really unusual. He wins 59% of the electoral vote. The Republicans are the red there, in a four-way race, sweeps the North, and the North is where most people are. So that's a big win, but he wins only 39% of the popular vote. It's a four-way race. He wins more than anyone else, but it still means that more people oppose Lincoln than support him. And yet he wins. The electoral vote decides things, as we've all learned. And the wide awakes really shape that victory. He wins because he particularly wins moderates in the lower North, in places like Pennsylvania, Indiana, Illinois, and he wins among young people in particular, which is to say he wins among exactly the people who are forming the wide awakes. You can't say he wins because of the wide awakes, and if they didn't exist, he wouldn't, but they are the advance guard of his election. And they also kind of flavor the election because they're so prominent, because they're so striking, and because Lincoln is basically silent during the election, as most candidates were. The wide awakes kind of define the election. And people who are happy say, look, we finally won an anti-slavery victory here, thanks to the wide awakes. People who are opposed say a paramilitary partisan force just took over our democracy. And you can see how people split from there. Lincoln says on election day, that settles it. He thinks it's over, or he says it's over. But obviously this election isn't over, and we know how a difficult election can kind of fester. The conflict isn't done, and the wide awakes aren't done. Immediately when Lincoln wins his election, people in the Deep South start moving for secession. They organize secession conventions. They call back their senators and their congressmen from DC. They appropriate money in the states of South Carolina, Georgia, and Louisiana to fight somebody for the state's defense. They expel free African Americans who are living there, and they start targeting federal post officers and the postmasters and stuff like that in the state. Like, they are ready to go in places like South Carolina. The upper South, places like from North Carolina, Virginia, Tennessee, Maryland, Missouri, are not sure what they're going to do next. And so the Deep South, the seceded states, start sending secession commissioners up north to convince their sister states to secede with them. And the argument they make often focuses on the wide awakes. They say, look, the North just took over the country with an anti-slavery paramilitary force, and they're coming down here next. It doesn't take much to switch out those torches for rifles. They're going to invade the South, and they're going to free slaves. They're going to inspire a race war, and you have to secede because the wide awakes already broke the Union. So you're not breaking the Union. It's already been broken by the wide awakes. So they use the wide awakes as kind of a boogeyman. Now, the same question of what should happen with the wide awakes after the election is really important in the North as well. You have the Civil War breaking out. You have secession breaking out. On the one hand, political clubs are supposed to stop on election day. They're supposed to go away. But you have hundreds of thousands of fired up young men in uniforms who've been training, who, if there's a civil war, could be awfully helpful, right? And there are people who say, we need to arm the wide awakes now. Lincoln starts getting letters right away saying, I could have 500,000 fighters for you if you need them. Get me the rifles and I've got your back, basically. And it's this dilemma. What is the danger? What is the benefit of that? Some people already start to arm, especially in St. Louis, which is kind of like the Baltimore of the Midwest, like a really rough, diverse city with a lot of kind of wide awake violence. They start arming right away. They get rifles, they get carbines, they reform their wide awake clubs as militias and spend that winter drilling in breweries and in basements and stuff like that. You can hear the wide awakes marching with their rifles, training for something that winter. The big issue becomes this question about Lincoln's inauguration, because rumors are circling that Lincoln will be assassinated. We know those rumors are not baseless, right? He's starting to get letters, people saying he's going to be shot, he's going to be stabbed, and it all comes down to Baltimore. People say that his train will be stopped as he goes from Springfield to DC in Baltimore, and he'll be stabbed, he'll be blown up, there's a plot against him, and it makes sense, right? Baltimore is a place it would happen, and eventually it is a Marylander who assassinates him. So these are not crazy stories. Now, a lot of wide awakes contact him and say, we can arm, we can go with you. We can be a bodyguard. We've been doing this for months now. We can bring 100, we can bring 10,000. What do you want? We have your back. This is a picture of wide awake gathering around Lincoln's home in Springfield. And it presents him with a dilemma. On the one hand, his life really is in danger. On the other hand, there's a cost to marching an army of uniformed Republican partisans into DC, right? Like that would scare an awful lot of people. Lincoln stands them down. He likes the wide awakes during the campaign, but at this point he realizes it's going to do more harm than good, that it will scare away potentially supportive people. It might push states to secede. So he puts it out through his young secretaries who know a lot of the young people in the wide awakes, stay home. Don't come to DC. Don't come to DC in uniforms. You can come as an individual. Do not, or don't go to Baltimore either. Don't play a role in this right now. And it's really an act of political bravery, right? Like his life is at risk. And there are other leaders at other times who take their supporters and march on the Capitol. We've seen that. Lincoln stands them down and puts kind of the benefit of the country ahead of his own personal safety. And yet, when he's inaugurated in DC, there are all these people on Pennsylvania Avenue in plain clothes who, right after he gives his first inaugural speech, take wide awake hats out of their pockets and put them on their heads. So they're there in the crowd. They attend in large numbers, but they don't march. They don't scare anybody. About a month after this, Fort Sumter is fired on. The Confederacy begins the war. South Carolina fires upon a federal fort. But no one is actually killed at Fort Sumter. It begins the war. It begins a mobilization, but it's essentially bloodless. The first bloodshed takes place in Baltimore. Maybe you guys learned this in high school history. Right after that attack, Northern soldiers are moving south through Baltimore to defend DC and do something about secession. And they have to walk across Baltimore. There are 2 train stations. They have to get off one and walk down Pratt Street to the other. First, some Pennsylvanians walk down, and these crowds of people in Baltimore curse them, yell at them, and they get to the other station and they ride off. But then these Massachusetts troops come through. And the National Volunteers, that anti-wide awake militia I told you about before, they get people out in force with guns, with bricks, with bottles, and they attack the soldiers. And 5 US soldiers are killed, 12 civilians are killed. It's the first bloodshed of the Civil War. And it doesn't happen in a field in Virginia. It doesn't happen at a federal fort. It happens in the same streets where the mobbing and the political violence had been escalating for years. That's how the Civil War starts. It goes from politics and political organizations to paramilitary organizations. Nearly the same thing happens in St. Louis a month later. Those wide awakes who'd been marching, arming all winter, they attack the local Confederates and they kill 30 people, or Confederate leading people. So both in Baltimore and St. Louis, wide awakes and wide awake enemies start the war, start the bloodshed. And from there, the Civil War is basically on. The people in the wide awakes sign up to fight for the Union in huge numbers. That original Hartford Club of the original 36, almost all of them serve and some of them die. Companies enlist en masse altogether. A lot of the most prominent wide awake leaders become prominent generals. People like Ulysses S. Grant trained wide awakes during the campaign and then go on to win the war. And after the war, the people who the wide awakes appealed to, these young Northern Republican aggressive figures, they basically win the country. They win the peace afterwards. Though those Ohio presidents for the rest of the century, they're from exactly this group. 5 of the 9 presidents in the rest of the 19th century were either wide awakes or had wide awake affiliations. Congressmen, senators, treasury secretaries, this kind of thing, were all wide awakes in youth. Eddie Yergison, the guy who makes that original cape, goes on to be a famous designer who redecorates the White House in the 1890s, gives it electricity for a President, Benjamin Harrison, who was a wide awake out in Indiana. So these guys win the nation, inherit the nation. They lose a lot of their anti-slavery and beliefs in equality along the way, but they inherit the Gilded Age republic. And the wide awakes are really prominent for the rest of that century. This picture, this guy here is George Holt. In 1914, in 1860, he was a wide awake in New Hampshire, fights in the war, he's wounded in the war. He's kind of showing off his uniform at the end of his life. And you can see how much the movement has aged from this dynamic, aggressive, youthful movement to George showing off his cape. And then for a long time, we stopped talking about the wide awakes. Most people weren't taught about them. They're not in history books. Their perspective, their image on what happened with the Civil War is a lot darker and more worrisome than Honest Abe, right? It's a harder story. So I think we're happy to put it away. I got interested in the wide awakes and worked on them a little. And then 2017 happened. And I think many of us saw the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville. I happened to go to the UVA, so I was especially struck by it. We collected a tiki torch for the Smithsonian, and it was really striking to see this model of marching with torches being brought back for an entirely different cause, unknowingly kind of looking like what people did in 1860. Right around the same time, there's a tiny little historical society in Milford, New Hampshire, and they go up into the attic behind the rafters to clear it out, and they find this rumpled piece of fabric, and they open it up, and it's this huge wide awake cape and torch that belonged to George Holt. That guy wearing that, you see the eye insignia? It was discovered 110 to 120 years later in this attic. It was like this symbol that had been kind of hibernating for basically a century, had been forgotten about, and is discovered right around the same time as the Charlottesville March. So as a curator at the Smithsonian, we collected both the torches, and I've been thinking about what they kind of say to each other. This history, how does it kind of communicate with our present? What do the wide awakes tell us about divisive politics? And this question that people often ask now, does it say something about the coming of another civil war? Now, I think that talk is a little overblown, and I also think a historian is the worst person to try to predict the future. So don't listen to me on that. But I do think that studying the story of the wide awakes tells us something about democracy, that there's inherent paradox in democracy that I think we overlook, that the wide awakes reveal to us. On the one hand, democracy is designed for the peaceful transfer of power and the peaceful voicing of citizens' views, right? It's supposed to be pacifying. On the other hand, to get people to engage, to get people to stand up, to mobilize, you often use the most aggressive, militaristic elements. The wide awakes lean into this, right? They are an army marching against slavery. You can't get people to vote against slavery for a moral cause, but when you get them mad enough, the systematic organization of hatreds and the military uniforms, you mobilize them. So there's something pacifying and mobilizing in democracy, kind of at odds with each other. I think it's a tendency we should think about from this story as we consider how to engage in politics today. To me, the lesson of the wide awakes is that the same movement which marched for the best of causes, ending slavery, also managed to bring the worst of consequences, the Civil War. And that tension is inherent in their story. I am happy to answer any wide awake questions. I will talk all day about them, any Smithsonian questions, anything like that.
About 15 minutes for your questions. Again, if you have a question, you can use the mic over there or right here.
Hey, I'm really looking forward to reading the book. I'd heard of the wide awakes, but now I know more than I knew before I stepped in the door. But so I have a ton of questions, but I'll narrow it down to one that's sort of interesting to me, which is how did they end up getting the nativist gangs involved? Because I think of them as the people behind the draft riots in New York, and even that image of the Pratt Street riots, one of those guys looked like they're trying to make him look like a plug ugly or something. So I mean, how do they convert these guys? They seem like totally opposed to any kind of anti-slavery.
Yeah, right. And in the same movement that has a lot of immigrants, recent immigrants, how do you get them all organized? Part of it has to do with partisanship at the time, that the people who are most anti-immigrant are also anti-democrat. The big Democratic Party, which is the biggest party at the time, has a lot of immigrants in it, has a lot of Irish Catholics coming into the North. And these same guys basically hate both sides, right? So they're mad enough at the Democrats in their own communities, and they've been fighting them in the streets in Baltimore and Philly and DC for years. Now here's a venue, now here's a movement, now here's an army who you can kind of get together with. Also, a lot of the people who are opposed, or I'm sorry, a lot of the people who are know-nothings are kind of white, Anglo-Saxon, Protestant evangelicals. And part of the thing that goes with that is that they're also pretty anti-slavery. They're really anti-immigrant, right? In xenophobic, nasty ways. But that kind of also jives at the time with being anti-slavery. It's kind of interesting and surprising, but it's not like these guys are just mean and xenophobes and hate everybody. They're particularly focused on certain groups. The other thing is the know-nothings have a conspiracy theory, basically, right? They believe that the Catholic Church is conspiring against American democracy. That's their main thing. It's not too hard to take that crazy conspiracy theory and put it on a real conspiracy that slavery is conspiring against American democracy. So it's similar habit of mind. But at the end of the day, they want to fight the same people. They want to fight the Democrats. They can kind of align. And the country's so big and disconnected, and the wide awakes are cellular. They're in companies. They don't really have to be friends with the immigrants. They can be in a different community, not even be entirely aware. So it's surprising, but it's kind of one of these weird things, how they march together.
Thanks, John. I'm Christina. I get one of my first questions is, did you explore it all? And obviously, there's so much that you know that doesn't make it into the book, but kind of about the 1856 election and John C. Fremont and the Fremonters, and how they were also doing all of these kind of political parades and marches and torches and things, and even with like Kansas Nebraska Act that they have, you know, marches and whatever going into that. And like the relationship of how much did a young guy like in Connecticut know about that stuff that had happened 4 years earlier, and how much of it was like that was just how politics operated at the time. And then my second question is just...
Can I answer your first question? Then yes, another? Awesome. Yeah, they're living in the same culture, the same world, with this kind of big public political culture, rallies, parades, processions. Political clubs aren't new, right? Like what the wide awakes add to it is militarism. That they are organized, they're orderly, they're wearing uniforms, they're in companies. They're not the kind of raucous, rowdy, drunken clubs who usually run elections. They're adding this element that really sets them apart and makes them distinctive. But they're thinking back to 56, the previous presidential election, because John Fremont almost wins. The Republicans, he doesn't win, but it's a beginning of a new anti-slavery party that gets close. It has a good shot. And so they're building on that. But again, it goes back to these weird alliances. In the 1850s, there were clubs called wide awakes, and they were anti-immigrant clubs in places like New York and Brooklyn and Boston. 4 years later, they start a new club called the Wide Awakes that's focused on something different, on slavery. So what are these? It's your question about Jurgensen. What did they know? Like, you couldn't start a club called the Proud Boys today and not be aware of the one, they still exist, but not be aware of January 6th or whatever. So they must have known that they're building on this culture. But Eddie Jurgensen is 19 years old. His notes, his letters to his mom, they're not great, right? His handwriting's bad, his spelling is bad. He's not the most educated person at the time. So what he knows about the previous movement, I'm not sure. But also, a lot of these guys, because they're so young, because they're 19 and 20 years old, they're being kind of given a boost up by people who are half generation older, who are 30 years old, 35 years old, and remember the last campaign and are excited to see a younger generation trying out this new model. So I'd say it builds on it, but it's really distinctive at the same time.
And then my second question was about just the research process. As you mentioned, you know, there's not been a lot written about wide awakes, and therefore, you know, you always have that problem of like, okay, well then where is the material, and how did you go about kind of getting that stuff together to, you know, bring it into a book rather than something shorter?
I wanted it to be shorter, and it ended up being a book. I've been hooked on the wide awakes for 17 years. I got started on them, did a little bit, and thought I was done. But people just kept contacting me with like, I found a diary entry, I found a wide awake cape, and every time I thought I knew enough, I learned something completely new. Like I basically thought they ended with the election, and then I learned this whole thing about them becoming essentially paramilitary. And people came out of the woodwork because they were such a big movement, and because they were kind of grassroots and working class and also young. There are a lot of diaries all around the country. You know, a lot of those guys go on to fight in the Civil War, and they write a memoir about fighting in the Civil War a generation later, and they start with joining the Wide Awakes. So there's a lot of material. I went all over for this, you know, Wisconsin, California, West Virginia, just all over. There are tons of Wide Awake sources. They're just not by presidents, generals, judges. They're 19-year-old working class kids. So it takes a little digging to find them. They're not in the biographies or the big famous histories, but they wrote a lot. They had a lot to say, and there's actually a lot out there. And because also there's such a striking visual movement, because they had uniforms, because they had torches, because they had rallies, people wrote about it. Little kids, not little, young kids wrote the Wide Awake procession marched past my window in Philadelphia or whatever. So everyone comments on them in one way or another. So there was a lot to find. And then, like I said, 17 years, you just keep digging and digging and digging. I'm worried in another 17 years, I'm going to want to write another book on the same thing. Like, I hope I'm done now. I don't know. Did you have a question, ma'am?
Yeah, it's fascinating, and I didn't know anything about it. And I love the fact that, all these different people, young people especially, got together and made a difference. I'm curious, because the military part concerns me a little, just because I'm worried about militias these days. So do you think, like, if they hadn't dressed in military gear, would it not have worked? Like, was that necessary for it to work, or?
Well, I have an opinion. What do you think? I'll ask you
Hoping it
first.
wouldn't have- well, I'm hoping they still would have had a movement, but maybe that was the impact, like made a visual impact. I don't know.
Yeah, I don't either. I mean, I think the militarism is key, and it's not. The thing is, to a lot of them, it's not militarism to fight a war. Like, they don't know the Civil War is coming, and they write letters to their parents or whatever saying, we have no warlike intention, we're just marching, right? And there are a lot of organizations that wear uniforms and march around. Fire companies march, all these like ethnic organizations march. So to them, they think they're just mobilizing to win an election, beat the Democrats. But from 1,000 miles away, from Alabama or South Carolina, it looks like the end of the country, right? It looks like paramilitary marchers in the street. So partially it's a story of like political bubbles. What seems basically peaceful in Hartford looks terrifying in Charleston, and they just can't talk to each other that well. On the other hand, everyone is talking about what they call an irrepressible conflict. They feel like a conflict is coming, and the political situation is chaotic. This sense of playing with militarism, it is really mobilizing and motivating. And I think it gets people who weren't moral abolitionists, who weren't ready to get rid of slavery tomorrow for moral reasons, who are 17-year-old kids and want to join essentially a fraternity. I think it wins them over. So it is key. And at first it seems inspiring, and then it gets creepy. I kind of sympathize with your skepticism of them.
The torch, too, like you think then about the Ku Klux Klan, and
Yeah.
did they follow that same model later on of the Wide Awake? You know what I mean? Just the whole torches at night adds another
Yeah.
fear factor.
It's funny. I used to give talks about the Wide Awakes, and people would say Ku Klux Klan or like Nuremberg, like Nazis. And then January 6th in Charlottesville happened, and people jump forward a century and see what they saw in the news a week ago. And they're actually the fascists in the 20th century, like in Italy and Germany, have a similar origin, completely different causes, completely different ideologies. But this idea takes off in the middle of the 19th century that an organized, militaristic, orderly force will solve our society's problems. And sometimes that society's problem is getting rid of slavery. And sometimes that society's problem is much darker in the 20th century, but they all share a similar kind of origin story. They're like twisted cousins or something. So it's not crazy to see those parallels, or with the KKK. Yeah.
John, we have a question from our audience watching online. One question, but it probably could be two. Can you describe your research and your writing process?
Research, I mentioned a little. I try to prioritize when I research sources that haven't been cited before, that come from people on the ground in this grassroots movement. So like, if you're choosing between the letter of a 17-year-old and a speech by Lincoln, the letter of the 17-year-old kind of takes precedence. And because this movement was big, especially in the North and the lower North, I tried to focus on places like Pennsylvania, Illinois, sources kind of in the middle of the country, especially non-elite voices. That was mainly what I looked into. And then they're all through the newspapers. I didn't talk too much about this, but the whole movement is spread by the newspaper. You have this national newspaper network that's really good at passing along bits of information at the time. You can really spread, there are thousands of newspapers in America, and they're talking about the Wide Awakes a ton. Like, I started on this story because I looked in one of these keyword searchable newspaper databases, Wide Awakes 1860, there are 15,000 hits. Like, there's a story there, you know? So just through these papers, a lot of incredible stories are told. Some of them funny, some of them tragic. The papers are really lively back then. What was the writing process? I can't imagine that would be interesting to anybody else. Like, wake up early and drink a lot of coffee. Do it every day until it's, I don't want to say do it every day until it's dead, but like get fixated on it. It's like a wrestling match, and then it's done, and you go like, what just happened to me? You know, that's
I
my
think
process.
That is the question we get the most
Oh, yeah.
from our online audience. Most people here,
Yeah.
because it's like metallurgy that you've done. So
You know, but there are people who like can't not do it also. Like my wife would probably rather that I weren't up every morning writing, you know? Sometimes it's compulsive too, but it's like in the Stephen King on writing book. If you sit for 2 hours every day, you're going to come out with something. I don't know. I find early mornings really useful. I find caffeine really useful. I like to do all the research and then write. So it just pours out. Some people research and write as they go, but for me, it's almost like a fugue state, you know, like you're the flow state they talk about with athletes. Like you're just writing and you're not even thinking too much, and a lot of outlining before that. But everybody's different. I couldn't tell another person how to do it. Did you have a question?
Thank you for expanding my mind, because I never heard of this either as a millennial. We didn't learn this in high school, whatnot. So thank you. You mentioned one of the tikis are in the Smithsonian Museum. Which one was that they're in, or the pieces?
Oh yeah. You mean which museum or which? It's in the American History Museum on the mall, like 12th and Independence in DC. Yeah, we have that. We have this collection. It's weird. We were collecting torches going back to like the 60s, just campaign torches. And then these guys go to Home Depot for their rally and get tiki torches. It's like they're doing what again after a century? Nobody marched with torches in America for a century, or most people didn't. And then they bring this thing back, and it's creepy and upsetting, but you can see how it was powerful for the same way the wide awakes were powerful. Like it worked on some level, and that we all know that picture and all remember that, I assume.
And it was like like the one lady said, growing up with Black history definitely was reminded of what the Klan marched with, and also even with the witch hunters marched with for Salem.
Yeah, I think
That's what it reminded me of too.
there's the torches. Nighttime is powerful too. You do a rally at 2 a.m., it hits different than 2 p.m., especially with the wide awakes in 19th century America before electricity. Cities are dark, cities are creepy. There aren't always street lights. All light is labor and money, right? Like, and there aren't even really police in most cities at that point. So 1,000 people marching through your city with torches in the middle of the night, it really catches your eye. And it was, I don't want to sound like I'm complimenting the people in Charlottesville, because it was hateful and terrible, but in terms of catching the public's attention, marching with those torches at night was a successful move. Like we remember that not to defend their horrible actions, but as we think about like how to protest, how to get people's attention, I think that's one thing people have used successfully.
Thank you again.
Oh, you know what I should also say? Sorry. I have it. Yeah, so do you see the colorful picture there? People brought back the wide awakes in 2020. I don't know if you remember, there was this social justice arts movement. They liked the story of the wide awakes, and they made neo wide awakes basically in 2020. They're still around. I think they're going to reform for this election. And they borrowed some of the wide awake symbols, like the open eye symbol, but they made it what felt to them like 21st century style, like much more colorful, much more vibrant. And it's not a mass movement, not hundreds of thousands of people, but it was a successful way to like borrow a little bit from a movement, like a tactic, and reapply it.
another one from our audience online, and you touched upon this a little bit, but piggybacking on the last question in regards to the Smithsonian, what role does your position at the Smithsonian play in your work and your historical understanding?
Oh, it's all like, I mean, it is my job and my privilege to do this stuff. So it is my work. Historical understanding, going into our secure collections and seeing these physical objects just has a power to make this story real in a way that I think, as much as I love written sources, reading diaries and letters and newspapers, seeing the torch, seeing a cape through our exhibits, and especially in our collection, seeing kind of that this story, it's not just something in a history book. It's really, these people lived, they marched, they had a physical reality and a humanity. It makes it easier to kind of jump from present to past for me and really empathize, I think. And also we collect for the future, right? Like we go to protests, rallies, conventions to collect objects from 2024 that should be in a museum in 100 years. So we start thinking, how is the past influencing the present? And also how is the present going to look in the future? And all that jumping around in time, what from the 2024 election might be compelling in 21, 24, I think it kind of trains your mind a little to empathize across time. But also, nobody really knows how to do history or preserve things. And so we're all just doing the best we can. I think it's important to know it's not a science. Like people are just piecing it together. But the more you interact with these objects as physical things, the more I think you can move through time and empathize with people.
Please help me to thank our author, John Grinspan.
Thank you. And thank you.
Now, as I mentioned earlier, John will be out there in about 5 minutes to sign your books. Sarah, you know this joke, so you're not allowed to laugh. You can't get your library book signed, so please, Sarah, you're not allowed to laugh, Sarah. Please purchase a book from our partners, Snug Books, this evening, and we'll see you in about 5 minutes. Thanks for coming.
Thank you, guys.